The ring wasn't hers, the dress wasn't hers. Even the name she wore into that church on a gray October morning belonged to a stranger she hadn't yet decided to become. Her mother had handed her all three like they were practical things. A ring from the Hartwell estate, resized twice because the previous owner's hands had been larger. A dress of ivory silk that had been her aunt's, taken in at the waist and let out at the shoulders, smelling faintly of another woman's cedar and rose water. And the name, Mrs. Hartwell, which people began using before the ink on the register had dried, as if the word itself was the thing that needed to happen, and she was merely the occasion for it. Nora Fenwick had been 23 years old when she married Thomas Hartwell. She had known him for 11 weeks. She had not loved him. She had not pretended to love him. She had sat across from him at her parents' dining table in Halifax while the November sleet came sideways against the windows, and she had looked at this quiet, careful man with his careful hands and his careful way of listening, and she had thought, I can manage this I can work with. She had been wrong about almost everything else that year. She had been right about that. Thomas Hartwell was not unkind. That was the first and most important thing, and Nora had spent her first year of marriage recording it in the ledger she kept in her own mind, the real one, not the version her mother kept for appearances. He did not raise his voice. He did not spend money they didn't have, which was notable because they had less than anyone in their social circle had been told. He came home when he said he would and left when he said he would, and when Nora rearranged the household accounts to cover the gap his brother Owen had left with 2 bad debts and a disappearing act to Montreal, Thomas had looked at her revised figures and said simply, quietly, I didn't know you could do that. She had not said, there is a great deal you don't know I can do. She had said the numbers aren't hard. The situation just needed looking at directly. He had looked at her then, really looked, the way he didn't usually, and she had filed that look away in the same mental ledger and gone back to the figures. They were not unhappy. She wanted to be clear about that, if only to herself, because the story she was living had no villain in it, and that made it harder to name. Thomas was decent and steady and increasingly grateful for the quiet competence she brought to everything she touched. She managed the Halifax house, the correspondence with his solicitor, the social obligations that his work at the shipping firm required, and she did it without complaint and without credit because that was the arrangement, and she had agreed to it with her eyes open. What she had not agreed to, had not been told about, had not been given the chance to weigh, was Lydia. Lydia Hartwell, Thomas's younger sister, had been living in St. John when Nora married into the family. The distance had seemed like a mercy. It had been 18 months of manageable silence, of polite letters written and politely answered, of a woman-shaped absence that Nora had learned not to examine too closely. Then Lydia's engagement collapsed, and Lydia came home. She arrived in March when the Halifax harbor was still locked with ice and the sky had the flat gray quality of a winter that had outstayed its welcome. She came with 3 trunks and a story that had already been told in a particular way, and she came to the Hartwell house on Yonge Street, which was also Nora's house, and she stood in the entrance hall and looked at Nora with the sweet, wounded expression of a woman who had mastered the specific art of making every room rearrange itself around her. The story, as Nora received it, was this. Lydia had been engaged to a man named Gerald Oakes, a solicitor's son from St. John, with a respectable income and a family name that opened certain doors. The engagement had ended. Gerald had ended it, after what Lydia described as a misunderstanding of considerable cruelty. She had been wronged. She was devastated. She needed family. This was the version Thomas believed because Thomas loved his sister and because believing her was easier than asking more questions. And because he had not been in St. John 18 months ago and therefore did not know what Nora knew. Nora knew because of Margaret Oakes. Margaret Oakes, Gerald's younger sister, had been Nora's school friend at the academy in Dartmouth, had written to her every few months ever since, and had written most recently in February with a letter Nora had read twice at the kitchen table before folding it carefully and not mentioning it to anyone. The engagement had not ended because of a misunderstanding. It had ended because Lydia had spent 3 months cultivating the trust of a young man named Peter Vance, the son of a business partner, new to St. John, unaware of the social architecture, and had used his name to give Gerald Oakes a reason to look somewhere other than at Lydia. Peter Vance had apparently done nothing except attend 2 dinners and bring Lydia flowers once, which she had invited him to do. Gerald had believed the story because it gave him a villain and absolved him of the harder question of what he'd discovered about Lydia before it. Margaret's letter had been careful and precise. She was not a woman who exaggerated. Nora had said nothing. She had filed the letter in the back of her writing desk and told herself that it was not her family, not her situation, not her place. She had said this to herself for 2 weeks, while Lydia settled into the guest room and rearranged the parlor furniture and called Nora, "my dear," in a tone that was technically affectionate and functionally condescending. She had said it to herself on the morning Lydia came down to breakfast, and said, within Thomas's hearing, that she'd heard from a mutual acquaintance that Peter Vance was looking for a different position now, that St. John had become uncomfortable for him, that he'd been thinking of going west. Thomas had made a sympathetic sound and gone back to his newspaper. Nora had looked at her soft-boiled egg and thought, he is 24 years old and he is going to leave his home because of a story someone told about him and no one has corrected. She had put down her spoon. She had gone upstairs. She had sat at her writing desk for 17 minutes, looking at the wall. Then she had taken out a sheet of paper and begun. The letter to Margaret Oakes took 3 drafts, not because she didn't know what she needed to say, she had known for 2 weeks, but because the first draft was angry, and anger on paper was evidence of a motive she didn't have, and she needed to be believed. The second draft was too polished, too managed, the kind of thing a lawyer wrote. The third draft was what she had always been best at, simply the facts, in order with dates like a ledger. She sent it before she let herself think about what came after. What came after was a Thursday afternoon in April, when the ice had finally gone out of the harbor and the air smelled for the first time like something other than winter, and Nora was in the back garden doing exactly nothing. Which was unusual enough that Thomas noticed through the kitchen window and came outside to see if something was wrong. "Nothing is wrong," she said. "I am thinking." He stood beside her with his hands in his coat pockets and the specific patience of a man who had learned in 16 months of marriage that Nora Hartwell's silences were occupied, not empty, and that interrupting them was not useful. She said, "I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen to all of it before you respond." He said, "All right." So she told him. She told him about Margaret Oakes's letter. She told him about Peter Vance and the flowers and the 2 dinners. She told him what Lydia had said at breakfast about Peter thinking of going west, and the specific quality of her voice when she said it, the particular lightness of a woman who knew herself to be the cause of something and had no interest in examining that too closely. Thomas listened. He was a man who listened with his whole body, very still, eyes on her face. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Why didn't you tell me in February?" "Because," Nora said, "I thought you would choose your sister over the facts, and I didn't want to have that argument until I was certain the facts were worth having the argument over." He looked at her. "That's a very cold-blooded way to make a decision." "Yes," she said, "it is. I have been cold-blooded about it for 2 weeks and I am tired of it, which is why I am telling you now." He was quiet again. The harbor wind came up over the garden wall and pushed at the hem of Nora's coat. "You believe Margaret Oakes," he said. "I have known Margaret Oakes since I was 14, Nora said. "I have never known her to exaggerate, invent, or arrange the truth to suit herself. She is, in my experience, one of the most straightforwardly honest people I am aware of. Yes, I believe her." Thomas turned to look at the garden. His jaw worked once, resettling. He had his father's chin, which she'd noticed in the wedding portrait in the upstairs hallway, the same particular quality of stubbornness that, in a good man, looked like steadiness. He said, "What do you intend to do?" "I intend," Nora said, "to write to Gerald Oakes. Not to restore the engagement, that is between them and not my concern. But to tell him what I know about Peter Vance, so that Peter Vance's name can be corrected through the right channel, and so that Gerald Oakes understands that he was given a story instead of a reason." Thomas turned back to her. "That will implicate Lydia. Correcting the story will implicate Lydia," Nora said. "Lydia implicated herself when she told it. I am simply refusing to be the person who keeps quiet about it." He looked at her for a long moment, the same look she'd filed away a year ago when she'd rearranged the household figures and he hadn't expected her to be able to, like something had come into focus that he'd been looking at from the wrong angle. He said, "Will you let me speak to her first?" Nora said, "You have until Sunday." Thomas spoke to Lydia on Friday. Nora did not ask what was said. She could hear the conversation through the floor of the upstairs sitting room, not the words but the shape of it, the long periods of silence that were Thomas being careful, and the sharp upward bursts that were Lydia being Lydia. It lasted 40 minutes. When it was over, Thomas came upstairs and sat in the wingback chair by the window and looked at the harbor for a while. Nora did not ask. She waited. He said, "She says Margaret Oakes has always disliked her, and that this is an act of revenge." "Is that what you think?" Nora asked. He was quiet. He said, "I think she is frightened, and she is doing what she does when she is frightened, which is to reframe until the version is one she can live with." Nora looked at him. "That is a very perceptive thing to say about your sister." "I have been watching her do it since we were children," Thomas said. There was something tired in it. Something that had been tired for a very long time. She said, "Then you know this isn't new," he said. "I know." She waited, he said. "Write the letter." Nora wrote to Gerald Oakes on Saturday morning. She wrote carefully, not coldly, not as an accusation, but as a correction. She named the dates. She described what Margaret had told her. She said explicitly that Peter Vance, to the best of her and Margaret's knowledge, had done nothing inappropriate. She said that she was writing not to reopen any question between the Oakes and Hartwell families, but because a young man's ability to remain in his own city should not depend on a story that wasn't accurate. She sealed it, addressed it, and gave it to the post herself. Then she went back to the household accounts, because the household still needed managing regardless of what any of them had decided in the last 72 hours, and relief, she had learned this, was not a place you could stay. It was somewhere you passed through on the way to whatever came next. What came next was Lydia. She found Nora in the kitchen at 10:30 on Saturday evening, which was unusual because Lydia did not generally seek out rooms that involved actual household functioning. She stood in the doorway with her arms folded and her expression at the particular angle that Nora had come to recognize as the angle Lydia used when she had prepared something and was deciding whether it was still the right ammunition. "You sent the letter," Lydia said. "Yes," Nora said. She did not look up from the preserves she was labeling, without waiting to hear what I had to say. "I heard what you had to say to Thomas," Nora said, "and Thomas heard it. He made his decision." "Thomas is—" Lydia started again. "This is my life you are dismantling." Nora set down the jar and turned to face her sister-in-law. She was a small woman, Lydia, but she had never seemed small. She had the particular talent of women who had been beautiful and noticed from childhood, which was to fill a room with expectation rather than with presence. Right now, in the kitchen at 10:30 in an old wool dressing gown, she just looked tired. Nora said, "Peter Vance is 24 years old. He is, as of last month, planning to leave St. John because staying has become uncomfortable. He brought you flowers once, at your invitation, and attended 2 dinners, and his name has been used for 8 months to explain something you did not want examined. I am not dismantling your life. I am correcting something that should not have been standing in the first place." Lydia looked at her. "What do you know about any of this, about what it is to have your engagement fall apart and have no good explanation to give anyone?" "I know that the explanation you gave damaged someone who had nothing to do with it," Nora said. "He would have gotten over it. He was thinking of leaving his home," Nora said. "People do not leave their homes because they have gotten over things." Lydia was quiet. Something moved through her expression. Quick, not quite stayed. "What would you know about it?" she said, but it was smaller than the question she'd been preparing and they both knew it. Nora said, "You may be angry with me. That is fair. I did this knowing you would be angry, and I did it anyway, because there was a person whose situation I could correct and I was in the position to correct it. That's the whole of it." Lydia looked at her for a long moment. Then she said something that Nora hadn't expected. "Why did Thomas listen to you?" Nora blinked. "He never used to," Lydia said. "He never used to listen to anyone. Our father couldn't make him. Our mother certainly couldn't. He's been—" Lydia stopped. "He listens to you," she said. As if this was the fact she'd been circling around for 8 months and had only now named directly, Nora said, "He listens because I don't tell him what to think. I tell him what I know and let him think it himself." Lydia looked at the kitchen floor. "I was going to tell Gerald eventually," she said. When things had settled, Nora did not say, "You were not," she said. "It's better this way, cleaner." Lydia made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Then she turned and went back upstairs, and her footsteps going away sounded different from her footsteps coming. Less like a woman who knew where she was going and more like one deciding. The letter to Gerald Oakes was answered in 9 days. Nora was at the writing desk on a Tuesday morning when Thomas brought it in. He stood in the doorway and held it out to her, and his face had the expression she'd started to be able to read. The particular arrangement of his features when something had happened that he hadn't anticipated and was still accounting for. She opened it. Gerald Oakes wrote plainly, which she had not expected. She had expected defensiveness or formality or both. Instead, he wrote 3 short paragraphs. He said that he had received her letter. He said that he had already had certain doubts about the account of Peter Vance's conduct, but that it had been easier to leave those doubts unexamined. He said he appreciated that she had not left them unexamined on his behalf, and that he intended to write to Peter Vance directly. He did not mention Lydia. He said only, in the final line, that he hoped the situation could be resolved with as little additional disruption as possible to all parties. Nora read it twice. Then she handed it to Thomas. He read it. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He's a better man than I gave him credit for. When they find out they've been wrong and they'd rather fix it than defend it." Thomas looked at her. "We should probably tell Lydia." Yes, Nora said. You should tell her. He folded the letter. Not me? It should come from you, Nora said. She needs to understand that you are not standing against her. I'm the one who corrected the situation. You're the one who decided it should be corrected. Those are different things, and she needs to understand the difference. Thomas looked at her again with the look she'd been filing away for 16 months, the one she hadn't figured out how to stop cataloging. I don't know, he said, how you think about things the way you do. I keep household accounts, she said. You learn to track what actually happened versus what everyone agrees to say happened. The gap between those two things is where the real numbers live. He almost smiled. It was a rare occurrence. She noted it. He told Lydia that afternoon. Nora stayed out of it. She was in the back garden again. This time actually doing something, staking the early peas along the fence, listening to the particular quality of the harbor in spring, which was the sound of things moving again after the long-stopped winter. She heard the conversation this time through the open window rather than through the floor, and it lasted longer than Friday's. Thomas's voice steady throughout, Lydia's moving through several registers before settling somewhere quieter. When it had been quiet for 20 minutes, Thomas came out to the garden. He stood beside her and watched her stake the peas without offering to help, which she appreciated because he would have done it wrong. He said, she's going to write to Peter Vance herself. Nora looked up. Whose idea was that? Hers, Thomas said. I didn't suggest it. She was quiet for a long time and then she said she'd been thinking about what you said about people not leaving their homes because they've gotten over things. Nora went back to the peas. That's the right thing to do, she said. It won't be easy for her. No, Thomas said. He was quiet. He said, I owe you an apology. Nora straightened up. For what? For the last 16 months, he said. I have let you run this household, and manage my correspondence and rework my accounts when Owen left, and handle every social obligation that I find exhausting to think about, and I have been grateful for it without ever saying so, and I have also been aware, somewhere I didn't examine, that you were doing a great deal more than I had any right to expect of you, and I didn't say anything about that either. He stopped. I should have said something. Nora looked at him. Thomas Hartwell was not a demonstrative man. She had known this from the first dinner. He spoke carefully, chose his words the way he chose everything, with the concern of a person who understood that the wrong selection had consequences. This was the most words she had heard him say at once in 16 months that were not about business. She said, Why are you saying it now? He said, Because you just did something that cost you something real, and you did it without asking me whether it was convenient for me. And that is, he paused, that is what I should have been doing for you all along, and I have not been. She looked at him for a moment. The garden was coming up slowly around them, tentative in the April cold. The way things came up in Halifax. Not all at once but incrementally, persistently, choosing to grow despite the temperature being not quite right. She said. It's a start, he said. I know it's not enough. I said it was a start, she said. That's different from not enough. Starts have somewhere to go. He was quiet. Then he said, I'd like there to be somewhere to go. Nora looked at the harbor over the garden wall. The ice was fully gone now. The water had the dark, particular color of spring in Nova Scotia, and there were ships moving on it again after the long locked winter, and she thought about borrowed dresses and other women's names and 17 minutes at a writing desk and all the things she had managed quietly for 16 months while the gap between the real ledger and the official version grew, and she said nothing. She said, So would I. It was the truest thing she'd said since the letters. Peter Vance wrote back to Lydia 6 weeks later. It was brief. Lydia showed it to Nora without being asked, which was itself something new. And it said that he appreciated the letter, that he had made his decision about St. John based on his own circumstances, and not only on the situation with the Hartwells, and that he wished her well. He did not forgive her explicitly. He also did not close the door. Lydia read it 3 times at the breakfast table. Then she set it face down and picked up her tea and said, I thought it would feel better than this. Doing the right thing? Nora said. Getting the letter, Lydia said, like the thing closing. But it just feels like the beginning of something uncomfortable, Nora said. That's what the right thing usually feels like at first. The comfortable feeling comes later if it comes. Lydia looked at her. Do you always know what to say? No, Nora said honestly. I know what's true. That's different. I get the saying of it wrong regularly. Lydia looked at her tea. Why did you stay, she asked, when you didn't love him? It wasn't entirely a question. Nora was quiet for a moment, because, she said, loving someone is not always the first thing. Sometimes the first thing is deciding that a person is worth staying for and then learning what that means. She picked up her own tea, and then, Lydia said, and then you pay attention, Nora said. And eventually it is not a decision you are continuing to make. It is simply a thing that is true. Lydia looked at her for a long time. Then she said very quietly, "I'm sorry I was awful to you." Nora said, "You were afraid and you were used to getting away with it. That's a hard combination to fight. I'm not sure I've fought it." "You wrote the letter," Nora said, "to Peter Vance. No one made you do that. Then, is that enough?" Nora thought about 17 minutes at a writing desk, and 3 drafts of a letter, and a decision made alone in the gap between the official version and the real one. She thought about Thomas in the garden, saying, "I should have said something," in the particular careful voice of a man who had just learned something about himself that he intended to act on. "I think," she said, "that it's where enough starts." Lydia nodded. It was not her usual nod, not the social one, not the one that communicated she had absorbed the information and filed it under things other people thought. It was smaller. More like a woman setting down something she'd been carrying without noticing the weight. Gerald Oakes wrote a note to Thomas in June. A brief thing, professional in its surface, but containing a sentence near the end that Thomas read aloud to Nora that evening after supper. "I understand I have your wife to thank for what was set right. Please convey my regards." Thomas looked at her over the top of the letter. She said, "I did not do it so that Gerald Oakes would thank me." "I know," Thomas said. "That's what makes it worth mentioning." She almost smiled. It was July before things between them shifted fully, not in a single moment, which was how Nora had always expected things to shift in other people's lives, and never quite believed would happen in her own. But incrementally, the way the garden had come up, the way the harbor had moved again, the way she had begun to notice in March and April and May that Thomas came home not just when he said he would, but with things to tell her. Small things, work things, occasionally absurd things that she hadn't known he noticed or stored up, and he had begun saying them at the supper table or over the household accounts, and she had begun to realize that this was what it looked like. This particular, unremarkable, actual thing. She was in the upstairs sitting room on a Thursday evening in July, working through the quarter's accounts, when Thomas came in and sat in the wingback chair without being invited, which was new, and looked at her for a moment in the particular way she'd been cataloging. She said, "The numbers this quarter are better," he said. "I know. I looked at them before I came up." She looked at him. "You looked at the accounts?" He said, "I have been looking at the accounts every month for the last 4 months. She blinked. "You never said." "No," he said. I was learning. I didn't want to say anything until I knew what I was looking at." She set down her pen. "And," he said, "I understand now what you did with Owen's debt. I went back through the figures for 2019 and I could see it, where it had been and where you moved it, and how you made the margin work without the firm finding out there was a problem." He paused. "I never asked you how you knew to do that," Nora said. "I learned bookkeeping from my grandfather. He kept the accounts for his hardware business for 40 years on figures that should not have balanced and always did. He told me, the numbers don't lie, only the way you organize them does." Thomas was quiet for a moment. He said, "I want to tell you something." She waited. He said, "When we married, I believed the arrangement was that I would provide the structure and you would provide the management, and that those were separate functions that happened to occupy the same house." He stopped. "I understand now that that was not what was happening. What was happening was that you were doing both, and I was doing one, and I had organized the figures in my head to make that look like an equitable arrangement." Nora looked at him. "That," she said, "is a very accurate description of the last 16 months. He said. He met her eyes. "I would like to change it," she said. "What does that look like to you?" He said, "I think it looks like me paying attention, in the way that you pay attention." She held his gaze. "That is a very large thing to promise." "I know," he said. "I'm not promising it. I'm telling you I intend it. There's a difference." She felt something shift in her chest that she elected not to examine too carefully right then, because she was still working, and the quarter wasn't done, and she had learned over a lifetime of managing things that the moment you let yourself feel the full weight of something was not always the moment that was convenient for feeling it. She said, "I would like that." He nodded. It was the particular nod she'd come to recognize as his, the one that meant a decision had been made, and he was going to mean it. She went back to the accounts. He stayed in the wingback chair and read, and they did not speak for another hour, and the harbor sat dark and still beyond the window, and it was, Nora thought, exactly what she had been hoping for without knowing she had been hoping for it. The last thing she hadn't expected arrived in September, in the form of a letter from Peter Vance. Not to her, to Lydia, which Lydia brought to Nora with the expression of a woman who had been slowly assembling something and had just found the final piece. He was not returning to St. John, the letter said. He had, in fact, taken a position in Halifax, the accounting firm on Barrington Street, which was a firm that Nora happened to know by name because Thomas occasionally consulted with them. He said that the correction of the St. John situation had, in a manner he hadn't anticipated, freed him to consider options he'd been avoiding. Halifax had always seemed like a more suitable fit for the work he wanted to do. He hoped, if the occasion arose, that there might be an opportunity to greet the family properly. Lydia read it 3 times. Her face moved through things Nora watched but didn't name. She said, "I don't know what to do with this." Nora said, "You don't have to do anything with it today." "He says the occasion might arise," Lydia said. "What does that mean?" "It means," Nora said, "that he is leaving the door neither fully open nor fully closed, and that what happens next is up to you." Lydia sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "I'm different now than I was in St. John." Nora said, "I know, he may find that relevant." Lydia folded the letter very carefully, the way she'd never folded anything in the 8 months Nora had known her. Like it was something she intended to keep, she said. "You changed things, not just the letter to Gerald. Everything. You changed how this house," she stopped. "I didn't like you when I came in March." "I know," Nora said. "I thought you were too quiet, too useful, the kind of woman who gets used up." Nora looked at her. "And now?" Lydia said. "Now I think you were the loudest person in every room and none of us had the sense to hear it." The wedding anniversary was in October. Thomas had never observed it particularly, not from indifference, Nora had come to understand, but from the particular obliviousness of a man who had not been taught to track the things that mattered in the domestic register. This year he came home on a Wednesday evening in mid-October with a book she had mentioned once in March, one she'd seen reviewed and said absently that she'd like to read, and he had apparently remembered and found it, and he set it on the table beside her tea without ceremony and said, "I thought you might want this." She looked at it, then at him. He said, I know it's not much," she said. "It's exactly much. It's the right kind." He looked slightly uncertain about what to do next, which was a new expression on him and which she found she didn't mind at all. She said, "Sit down, Thomas." He sat down. She poured him tea. They sat at the kitchen table in the Halifax house, with the October dark coming down outside and the harbor going gray in the evening, and she told him what she'd been thinking about, which was the quarter's projections and whether the Southside warehouse lease should be renewed, and he told her what he'd been thinking about, which was the same thing from a different angle. And they arrived at the same conclusion by different routes, and then sat with the particular satisfaction of that for a moment. She said, "We should have been doing this for 16 months, he said. "Yes, we should have," she said. "We have considerable time left. We could start now." He looked at her across the kitchen table with the harbor going dark behind him and said, "That is, I think, the most practical romantic statement I have ever heard." Nora picked up her tea. "It is entirely possible," she said, "that practical and romantic are not as different as advertised." He almost smiled again. She noted it. She had not arrived at this life the way she'd expected a life to arrive, not with clarity or certainty or love that presented itself neatly and said, "Here I am, take me." She had arrived at it the way she arrived at everything, by looking at the figures with honest eyes, by refusing to organize the numbers in a way that made an unequal arrangement look balanced, by sitting at a writing desk for 17 minutes in April and deciding that the weight of knowing something true was heavier than the weight of what came after saying it. She had not been rescued. She had not been chosen in the romantic sense of the word, not initially, not at the beginnings. She had chosen the arrangement, the house, the quiet man across the table, and then she had worked at it with the same precision she brought to everything, and she had insisted without drama on the real version of things. And the life that had arranged itself around that insistence, the husband who was learning to look at the real ledger, the sister-in-law who had written the letter that might become something, the October evening in the Halifax kitchen, with tea going cold and numbers that actually balanced. None of it had been promised to her. All of it was hers.